Welcome to Southend TV. My name is Tracy Chapman and today I'm joined by Simon Ashely Cross, who is the Green Party candidate for Rochford and Southend East. Welcome, Simon.
Morning.
Perhaps you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your association with Southend.
Yes, I'm Simon Ashely Cross, as mentioned. I originally, as you can probably tell by my accent, don't come from here. I was born and brought up and lived for about 45 years in Sheffield. I came to Southend to live with my partner and her son, Edward. And I've actually got very heavily involved in Southend. I didn't realise just how vibrant seaside towns were. And coming from Sheffield, which is well known for being a city of culture and music and diversity, it took me quite by surprise to see that Southend was not that much different. I tend to spend a lot of time absorbing myself in local culture, certainly local bands, local theatre, so something that I enjoy very much. One thing I did really notice when I came to Southend as a lifelong sort of campaigner and activist was that one of the larger problems with the Southend is that, as with a lot of seaside towns, there is quite a lot of homelessness. So when I came to Southend to actually live, I did get involved quite heavily with some of the voluntary homeless groups, including the Homeless Hub and Street Spirit, who tend to go out and look after the homeless people of Southend. I do find the town to be quite interesting because there is a very diverse split between the West and Leon's Sea, and between the Rochford and Southend East, which is what I'm hoping to represent, in that there seems to be a big split between the levels of poverty and of wealth. But I seem to find that there is a big community spirit wherever you go in Southend.
It is. It's a lovely town to live in, but also it's not just Southend that will be part of your constituency. It will also be Rochford, Great Wakering, Little Wakering, Barling.
Yeah, I actually live in Great Wakering. It's a lovely place, and Barling, it's somewhere that we need to strive to protect. And obviously with Rochford, there are inherent difficulties with regard to things like infrastructure and roads in Rochford. And as Rochford seems to be the place where there is quite a requirement for housing, it's very important that we take Rochford as a sort of a slightly separate case from the town itself, because it's surrounded by beautiful countryside. And so it's quite important that we look at Rochford and the villages around Rochford as being something of a different case to the requirements of the town of Southend itself.
It's often described as Southend's green lung, that whole area around there and along the Crouch and the Roach.
Absolutely. It's very nice that you mentioned the fact that it is the lungs of the town. We do have people in the Green Party who are constantly looking for ways to ensure that we retain the natural beauty, and certainly things like the trees. I mean, I've not hugged a tree for a very long time, but I do understand the absolute value of our green spaces.
So where does this sit with the Green Party's desire to build 100,000 houses a year? And you mentioned the infrastructure, road building. Are the Green Party in favour of improvements on our roads?
Right, I mean, the Green Party are very much opposed to looking at greenfield sites for further development. What we tend to look at is we work with a lot of agencies, and there is something that not a lot of people know, but Shelter have actually identified that in the UK there are actually 650,000 currently empty residences. The scale of homelessness, as identified also by Shelter and one or two other groups, is about 250,000.
So, what do you class as an empty home? Because obviously Southend being a seaside town will attract people that maybe live in London and own property here that they come to.
Yes, we fully accept that some of these properties are second homes that people use as vacation properties, but a lot of the empty homes are either in disrepair, which is very simple to actually take those houses on and renovate them and make them suitable for living. A lot of the houses are actually built specifically for ownership by overseas corporations. So a lot of the housing stock is actually empty by design.
Is that true in Southend?
There are plenty of empty properties in Southend.
But are they owned by overseas corporations?
Some are. It's very difficult to pinpoint exactly what the split is, but it is part of green policy to look at a mixture of taking houses back into public ownership and building council housing that is affordable in the truest sense of the word, not £450,000 what would have been mansions, but that are just generally a family home. So we believe in a mixture of looking for the properties that are genuinely empty and falling into disrepair and unused for no apparent reason, and obviously separating out the fact that houses have now become a commodity rather than the place where we live. So it's very important to obviously draw that distinction and then look to building not on the greenfield sites, but looking at reusing ex-industrial buildings that can be easily converted into residences, and also building new greener, more environmentally friendly homes with obviously provision to generate their own energy and properly insulated so we don't lose a lot of that energy through the property.
But if you look at Rochford and Southend East, if you take out the green areas around Rochford and the Wakerings, you're very constrained for building in Southend.
Absolutely.
And if there's a commitment to put more council housing up, where would you do it?
Absolutely, but there are, as I already sort of mentioned, there are, even if you just sort of drive around the Rochford and the Wakerings area, there are areas of brownfield which could be utilised for building. The most important thing is that what you should always do is start any development with the end in sight, and the end in sight is school places, provision of general practitioners, provision of adequate roads so you don't finish up with the horrendous problems of congestion which tend to occur around badly thought out developments. So it's important to think about the end of the development rather than just think about the actual commercial value of it. What we're actually looking at is making it so that your home does not finish up being a very, very expensive asset or somewhere that is taking up a large amount of the money that you can feasibly earn. A lot of people are pushed into poverty simply because of the fact that houses are either too expensive to buy, mortgages are very expensive, or simply because of the fact that people spend a very, very large percentage, sometimes up to 80 to 85% of their earnings on just paying rent. The other issue here is that people often ask us how we would pay for this, but at this moment in time, our government is actually committed to paying somewhere around £8.5 billion in subsidy to landlords, whether their houses are tenanted or not. So a lot of money is actually being siphoned off to private landlords, whether they have a tenant in those properties or not. And this is something that really that money must be reallocated, spread fairly around the country, and we must allow councils to build council housing again. We mustn't be at the mercy of people who are part of a system that allows rents and house prices to go out of control.
And my understanding is that the Greens want to bring in some kind of rent control. There's obviously a lot of private landlords in an area like Southend. How do you think that will affect the market? If people don't get the money for the properties, do you think that will mean that there will be less properties available to rent? Yeah,
I mean, part of the reason for operating rent controls is simply to try and reduce the poverty gap. In actual fact, landlords do sometimes fall into this category. We do have some very wealthy landlords in the UK, and in actual fact, the top 5% of people holding wealth in the UK increased their wealth last year, according to Forbes, by £51.4 billion in a single year.
And I understand that, but an awful lot of the landlords in Southend will be probably pensioners that have cashed in part of their pension, maybe bought a little flat that they think will sustain them through their retirement, and they may feel that they can't afford to keep that home on if they're not getting the cost of the rent coming in to cover the mortgage.
That sort of thing is fully understood, but taking housing as a single measure is what most parties do. What we tend to look at is the way that one part of society fits in with another, and some of the ways that we are looking at guaranteeing income for lower earners to reduce the number of working people using food banks, and the way of defending and protecting pensions, and of looking at care for people who can no longer care for themselves and require managed care through this social funding. We look at these as a group of measures which should allow for anything that is lost through property that was purchased as part of a pension package is compensated for those people who need it in a totally different way, by ensuring that they do have an income that keeps them out of poverty, and that their property, even though the rents will be slightly lower, actually just contributes to their overall standard of living.
You mentioned income. I think one of the Green Party, I've tried to read the Green Party manifesto, and it's only been a couple of days.
Yes,
but I think one of the policies in there was about guaranteeing a basic income. Do you think that encourages people to not work?
It's been tried on a very small scale in quite a number of places, one or two Scandinavian countries. It was tried in a small town in Africa, which was the first place it was tried. I can't remember the name of the town, but it was very, very successful. What it allowed was a basic safety net for everybody, from people with children who also got paid the basic income, so the children were provided for, right up through to the oldest of the pensioners. And what it tended to do was it made people able to actually do work that was more in keeping with themselves. It actually increased productivity where it was tried.
So you'll be expecting people to work?
This
isn't about people that are on benefits?
Because the basic income will just give a basic standard of living. What we will do is talk to organisations like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and find out what it would actually cost to give people the basic needs that they have.
And what do you think that would look like?
Well, the basic needs, as specified by Maslow, are that you need shelter, you need warmth, you need provision of health care, you need education, and you need to feel safe.
And what would you put? How would you put a value on that? At what level would you say a basic income would kick in?
It's very exploratory at the moment. What we are saying is that basic citizens' income is a policy that we've had for quite some time, and we have done quite a lot of modelling on this. It's still in its very early stages. What we would say is in the next Parliament we would look to looking at potentially an area of relatively high deprivation and trialling this on a small scale, just so that we could identify the overall requirement and the overall cost. One thing that basic income does do more than anything else is it removes the need for a zero rate income tax, because people would have sufficient to live on, so any income that they earn above that would all be taxable on a sliding scale, so some money would be recovered through working people. It would also remove any form of benefit fraud, and although that doesn't actually amount to a huge amount of money, it is something that actually puts money back into this programme, and it would also remove quite a lot of the health issues associated. It would help with health and social care, that people knew that they weren't facing day-to-day poverty and that their children are not going to struggle. I mean, I think one of the real sorts of things that comes across from the Green Party manifesto, unlike any other, is that, number one, we will not propose any policy unless we have fully costed it. We actually have a very experienced team of accountants who look very carefully at our policies.
So what do you think it would cost the basic income?
It's very difficult to put a figure on it because we have a population which is expanding all the time.
But I thought you just said you'd costed it.
No, I said we cost all our policies before we made them a commitment. All we're committing to at the moment, in a similar way to the Labour Party. The Labour Party looked at our 2015 manifesto and were quite envious that we had actually proposed such a bold measure. And Jeremy Corbyn even talks about piloting basic citizens' income. We don't know. That's the simple answer, is that we don't know at this moment. The computer can only tell you so much. So until we've run some sort of a pilot, we can't actually say for certain that basic citizens' income would work. But what it would do is solve a lot of problems that we have with society. It would reduce homelessness, it would reduce the poverty gap, which is one of our avowed aims, to actually bring the richest and the poorest a bit closer together. But in actual fact, as I say, in this particular manifesto, we talk about basic citizens' income as an aim, a goal for the future, possibly for a second or a third parliament. What we talk about in this manifesto is at least trialling it to see if it is a workable policy. We do that with almost everything. I mean, we looked at, when we were talking about renationalising rail, we looked at the East Coast Main Line, which has recently been sold off to an overseas foreign country, but it was actually contributing £1 billion per year to the Treasury for the last 5 years while it was still in public ownership.
And what would you say then to the people that run C2C, which is a very good line that runs through here? Why would anyone else want to take that over and run it? It runs fairly well at the moment.
It's not a case of somebody else taking it over and running it. It's a case of retaining the people that are running that, but not allowing all the profits that are made from running trains on our railways to be siphoned off to Holland and to France, where the companies that run these companies are based. It actually allows the Treasury to take in the money from what used to be public services. The fact is that there is no such thing as government money. It is the people's money which the government are the custodians of.
Absolutely, you have to take it off of some of us.
They very badly misspend that money. They spend it on a lot of vanity projects. Since Margaret Thatcher started selling off our industries, they were selling off public assets, not government assets, for no profit, for no real benefit to the community. And what we've found since they sold off the power companies, the railways, perhaps not so much things like British Leyland and British Steel, because they were industries that were in decline at the time, but certainly the utilities, what we've found is that the public are paying a lot more for these things. In fact, we pay the highest rail fares in the UK simply for shareholder value for overseas companies.
But people like me that are old enough to remember how bad British Rail was, how old I think we were travelling in 1940s rolling stock in the 70s and 80s. I mean, what do you say about that? Because it really didn't work. I know there is this wonderful vision of British Rail, but it really wasn't. It was awful.
The railways did work right up until the 1980s. And as with all industries that have been sold off, including the post office, including telecom, as soon as those industries are made to completely and totally fail as a consequence of underinvestment in infrastructure, they become very unattractive as a public asset. And the public start thinking, oh yes, if we can pull some money back into the public purse, then that's absolutely fine.
You don't think it's because they were state-run industry and had no need to improve? I mean, we all remember waiting months for a telephone line.
In the early 1980s and the late 1970s, it was the avowed wish of the Conservatives to actually sell off public assets, and they started a campaign of making them fail. People who don't remember that far back only have to look at the current attempts to encourage the failure of the NHS, which is the thing that the government is now trying to sell off. They're involved with a company in America called Kaiser Permanente, who are actually responsible for the fact that they now have 44 very, very carefully designed bundles which are very easy to sell off to American companies which provide healthcare on an insurance basis, but in actual fact they rule out most of the health needs of their insured patrons. Kaiser Permanente came into American healthcare in 1971, and American healthcare has stagnated since. And a lot of money has gone through to people who literally own shares in the company and not to the healthcare of the people. And this is true of all industries that benefit people. The energy industries, energy bills have gone through the roof and haven't really looked at the energy mix for the future. If you look at the water companies do not provide the services that they did when they were publicly ran. And in actual fact, any profits from those companies can be split in two ways. Some of it can be actually utilised to bulk up the public sector expenditure, and the other part of it can be used to gradually reduce the cost of these services, particularly the rail services. A lot of people are working very long hours and travelling to work using the rail services. The cost of their travel pushes a lot of people into poverty. After you've paid your rent and your travel, by the end of the month, a lot of working people are using food banks. We need to own these services. We need to reduce the fares to a decent, reasonable level, and any profits that accrue need to go back and be ploughed back into the country.
This is a very left-wing agenda with very big state ideas about it. How do you feel about that? The fact that you're going to encourage a very large state, lots of people working for it. Who pays for all those people that are working in the public sector? Because someone needs to earn the money.
Absolutely. It's very interesting that you should touch upon that, because the Green Party has a lot of social value. We are different to any other party in that anybody who chooses to be a member of the Green Party has some say in what we do. Our policies have all been road tested, run by our conferences, voted on by a significant number of members. Then what we've done, before we put the policy into any manifesto, we make sure that it can be afforded by money that already exists. As I've already mentioned, £8.5 billion is going to private landlords. Think how many council homes you can build with that £8.5 billion if you take it back from the private sector and allow councils to spend it prudently. If you think about other areas...
See, what you're doing in some ways is cutting back that entrepreneurial spirit that exists in Rochford and Southend, is in fact the whole of Southend. Do you not think people have got to earn money? We like to work and earn money in this town. It's one of our...
No, that's quite a misconception. What we're looking to do is to rebalance taxation. Corporation tax in the UK has been reduced to the lowest level of any of the EU countries, bar 2 or 3 very small countries, which are used by companies as shells for hiding taxation. Our country could increase corporation tax by 5 or 6 percentage points without it making any large business flinch. Those businesses would have to pay that taxation to keep trading in this country, but they couldn't find a better place to trade.
And what about the smaller businesses?
Smaller businesses are very much our focus. We believe in the entrepreneurial spirit. We believe in giving benefit to small startup companies. Most companies fail within their first year or two. We're looking at measures to actually reduce the burden of...
Just stopping you for a moment, because one of the eye-catching policies that is in your manifesto is for a 4-day week. How do you think that will impact on small businesses in Southend? We
have the longest working hours in the whole of Europe. We work longer than we should be doing. As I've already mentioned, people are sometimes travelling an hour and a half, 2 hours to get to their work and to get home from their work. They don't have a personal life. They don't have a work-life balance. The benefit to having people having, number one, flexible contracts, not 0 hours contracts, contracts where their weekly working hours are stated and their contract is negotiated with their employer. Where people have contracts that allow them to be working around about 30 to 32 hours a week, this is where basic citizens' income is a real benefit, because it takes some of that burden off the actual living wage.
But what about the business itself that has then got to employ somebody else? And at the moment we are very close to full employment. Every month you look at the figures, particularly in the summertime in Southend, when the tourism industry employs quite a lot of youngsters and others. I mean, how does that impact then on the business that is trying to keep open 7 days a week? Because many of our businesses are open 7 days a week.
Once again, we have to look at the overall plan. The overall plan doesn't just look at individual items in microscope. What we do look is the bigger picture. Where employment is concerned, you're very right. In the summer, there is plentiful employment in seaside towns. In the winter, people who have left home for various reasons and come and taken advantage of the fact that they can find some seasonal work in seaside towns become the homeless. This is why seaside towns have high rates of homelessness. If you look at the measures all taken together rather than look at individual measures taken one by one, the basic income allows for the minimum living wage, not the minimum wage, not this nonsense that the Conservatives have come up with, but the the living wage to be lower because you're already providing some of that. You're not providing it to Tesco's particularly, you're providing that across the board to allow the same benefit to smaller and start-up companies to employing staff as you allow to large multinationals like
But
Tesco's.
what if the people aren't there because you've reduced the working week to 4 days?
The people
You've
will,
got to find other people.
yes,
to
absolutely.
fill them.
And what it will do is it will reduce the number of hours that each person works, but will increase the number of people in the workforce with proper, meaningful, contracted hours jobs rather than 0 hours contracts.
But I still don't understand who is going to pick up the bill for that, because at the moment that looks like it's going to be the small business that's got to employ more people.
Small businesses.
Or it's going to be those of us that pay tax, someone who's going to have to pay for that. You've talked about corporations, but what do you expect the tax rates to be? Basic, higher rate for most of us?
At this moment in time, people should actually be able to meet a standard of living that is higher than 60% of the average income. So we would obviously set the basic tax rate without citizens' income to reflect that, to actually bring the people at the bottom end of the pay scales closer to those
So
at the
at what
top.
level of earnings do you think you can set that?
It's very difficult to put a direct figure on that because we don't know what the impact is going to be of leaving the EU on our economy. We don't know how much inflation is going to rise by. There are a lot of imponderables for the next government for 5 years. But what we will be doing is taking a very close look at this and making sure that we work with the Living Wage Foundation to make sure that we don't talk about a maximum wage as being a living wage. We work with organisations that can explain to us exactly what a living wage is.
But we can expect the tax rates to rise.
The tax rates are a very interesting thing because, as you know as well as I do, there are many corporations and companies that find ways and means through loopholes of avoiding taxation. At this moment in time, there is £34 billion per year of uncollected tax from large corporations. Smaller companies do not have the ability or the flexibility with their accounting to actually do that. So what we would do is level the playing field between large corporations and smaller businesses to give the smaller businesses the room to breathe and the room to survive. What we look at is reducing localised taxation on those businesses, but increasing localised taxation
But what about
on
on the
larger
individual?
businesses.
I understand that you want to attack the businesses, but what about taxation on the rest of us?
Yeah, we're not talking about attacking anyone. What we tend to find is that the 95% tend to fund the top 5%. I've already mentioned that the wealth of the top 5% of people in this country, according to Forbes, which is a very reputable measure of people's income and wealth, increased by £51.4 billion in a single year last year. Of the bottom 95%, Joseph Rowntree Foundation identified that 4 million more families, while these people were getting richer, were pushed into poverty. There is a relatively horrendous unfairness in that. There is something that anybody looking at that, particularly out of that 95%, has to start looking and thinking to themselves, why am I paying more than my share? So what we would look at is a balancing, not particularly making anybody have a much worse lifestyle.
Where would you expect to set the higher rate tax?
We'd be looking at people with excessive incomes. We need to look at
And
exactly...
what do you call excessive?
Well, anybody who is working in a company and the management are earning in excess of 20 times the salary of the poorest paid worker, we would look at people like that as being the
Do you
people
think
that
that
are
might drive
excessively...
talent out? Because they're the people that can go to Frankfurt or New York or anywhere else.
They're actually not. I mean, the fact
Well, you
is
say they're
that...
not, but they did in France, didn't they?
But what's
They left.
what's actually happened now that we're leaving the European Union is that it's quite clear that those opportunities are going to be fewer and fewer, and those people who consider themselves to be talent are going to have to find a way of utilising that talent in this country, because we're going to be working in a much smaller market, and we are going to have to be more innovative. We are going to have to be more...
You don't think they can go to the rest of the world?
The rest of the world have already stated that firstly and foremostly, if we do not pay the dues that we are required to the EU, we will also not be able to
But you
negotiate
don't
via
think
the
they'll
World
take
Trade
out our higher
Organisation.
paid talent? But then affects our economy.
This higher paid talent, this is actually, there is talent that isn't getting paid like that. A lot of the people who work in these higher management positions are simply people who've been working with these firms for a very long time. If you measure what talent is, you have to look at individuals.
Simon, it's been a pleasure to meet you this morning. It's been a really interesting discussion. Is there anything else you'd like to say to the people of Rochford and Southend East?
Yeah, there is one very important thing. I touched on this earlier when I was talking about the sort of local and constituency area. But the one thing that you will hear from the Green Party mentioned over and over again is that we are in crisis. Our air is so badly polluted that the government is now being taken to court to actually answer for why they are not stopping 40,000.
Here in Southend?
In South, we're so close to London. In the UK, there are 40,000 preventable deaths caused by the poor air quality. We're also very, very keen at looking at the overall global ability of the planet to actually sustain us living as we are now. So we will be, during this election and during almost every election, the only party that will routinely talk about climate change, about protecting our planet for future generations, about protecting species, about looking after animals, about animal husbandry. In fact, we are certainly very much against eye-catching policy like the repealing the fox hunting ban. We actually chose on the same day that Theresa May decided that she was going to talk about repealing the fox hunting ban, we decided to introduce our policy, which has been a policy for quite some time, removing the tax from female sanitary products, which we think is much more valuable to a much broader range of people than in actual fact bringing back a little bit of fox hunting where well-bred, fattened up foxes are chased through a field to ensure a kill. We think that's wrong. We also think that the way that we use the resources on this planet needs to be relooked at. The actual global green economy is at this moment in time estimated to be worth £400 billion. The innovation to actually unlock and untap that £400 billion is already here, and that's where your talent will come from. We need to be a world leader. We don't need to follow. We created a lot of the technologies in this country for creating green energy, for making greenhouses, for sustainable green living. A lot of the growing technologies to actually make sure that we don't have to rely on genetically modified produce because we can grow a lot of produce in a much smaller space. These technologies were invented in our universities. We have that knowledge and it won't go somewhere else. It needs somewhere it can thrive and flourish, and the UK is the perfect place for that. So
thank you very much. It's been a really interesting morning, Simon.
You're quite
Thank you for
welcome.
coming in.
No
That
problem.
was Simon Ashely Cross, who is the Green Party candidate for Rochford and Southend East.